Now, if you were looking for a guy that looks good in a beanie, you might want to look somewhere else. But if you were looking for quarterbacks, tight ends, and defense rankings for Week 11, I've got you. Let's go ahead and start it off with S tier of the quarterbacks. Great quarterbacks on a point-per-game basis. Lamar has a tough matchup versus the Browns, but that doesn't mean you don't play Lamar. While Justin Herbert, he has a great matchup versus the Jaguars. If you have two of these guys, you should consider trading one of them away so you can make your team stronger at another position. Now, in A tier, I do start it off with Matty Stafford versus the Seahawks. He is the NFL's touchdown passing leader. Now, he is fourth in passing yards as well. He's in A tier, not in S tier, because his floor is low if he doesn't throw for touchdowns, because he's a pocket passer. He doesn't run the ball. But right now, he's red hot with touchdowns, so you stay in the flames with Matthew Stafford. Patrick Mahomes versus the Denver Broncos. Now, this is a tough matchup for Patrick Mahomes. The Broncos have allowed the second fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. This is a good week to figure out if you want to ride Patrick Mahomes into the fantasy playoffs, because he has the hardest playoff schedule of any quarterback, and he plays the Broncos in championship week. So you'll find out this week if you really want to roll with him. Now, Dak Prescott, Raiders is not a bad matchup. The Cowboys have a much higher powered offense than the Broncos, so we should expect more points than what we saw in that defensive battle on last Thursday Night Football. Now, Dak, he's been bad these last two games, but they were against tough opponents. The Raiders are not one of those. That should help him get back on track. And Joe Flacco versus Pittsburgh. I love Joe Flacco this week. Our time with Joe Flacco is slowly coming to an end, so appreciate it while you got it. Joe Burrow is expected to be coming back in Week 13 or Week 14. However, the last time the Steelers played the Bengals, it was in Week 7 when Joe Flacco was the quarterback 6. So the Steelers have allowed the second most passing yards on the season, so we should expect another high performance from Mr. Joe Flacco. And Baker Mayfield versus the Bucs. It's the fourth hardest matchup for quarterbacks. The Bills have only allowed one quarterback to throw for over 250 yards, and no quarterback has thrown for 3 touchdowns. So hopefully, Baker, he hasn't been running in these past 3 games. Hopefully, he can add that floor to your game as well. And then Jared Goff versus Philadelphia. It's Sunday Night Football. It's going to be a great game. Lions, they're second in points per game. Eagles, they're 8th in points per game when they play at home. Goff has thrown for 2 or more touchdowns in 5 of his last 6 starts. And let's go into B tier. I do start it off with Caleb Williams. If you've had him over these last 2 weeks, you know you've been riding a high. It has been 2 of the easier matchups for quarterbacks. Now he does get to play the Vikings. It's not necessarily a bad matchup, but it's not a great matchup either. Caleb Williams is the quarterback 9 on the season, and last time he played the Vikings, which was in Week 1, he was the quarterback 9 on the week. Now, Jordan Love versus the Giants, back-to-back horrible games for Love, unfortunately, but he did have a spike game in Week 8 versus the Steelers and their poor pass defense. Now, Love gets to play the Giants, who have given up the 4th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. I can tell you the matchup is nice, but I don't have to tell you that Jordan Love is an auto start. Sam Darnold versus the Rams. Now, he did have a bad week in Week 10. Part of that was Seattle leading 38-7 at halftime. So he should have a huge bounce back game here this week. The only bad game about this Seahawks versus the Rams is it's not a primetime matchup. And then in C tier, you could really flip either Marcus Mariota and Aaron Rodgers around. I'm perfectly fine with that either way. But Marcus Mariota comes up on top for me because he gets to play the Dolphins. The Dolphins have given up the 2nd most rushing touchdowns to quarterbacks and have allowed the 8th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. Now, Mariota has been super serviceable in his starts, and it's a decent matchup. He's got a higher floor because he does rush the ball, so that's why I have him ahead. But Aaron Rodgers, against Cincinnati, he was the quarterback 7 when these guys faced off in Week 7. So I think this one could be another good one. It's in Pittsburgh, and it's still the 2nd easiest matchup for quarterbacks. And then in D tier, we got to talk about him, Jameis Winston versus Green Bay. I was wondering if we were ever going to say his name this season. In 2024, when he started 95% of the game or more, he threw for an average of 45 pass attempts per game. It's a tough matchup, but Winston wouldn't want it any other way. Kind of think of him as great value version of Joe Flacco. He just doesn't have Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. He has Darius Slayton and Wan'Dale Robinson. Now, J.J. McCarthy versus the Bears. Outside of his meltdown in Week 2, he's been the quarterback 11, which was against the Bears in his first NFL start, quarterback 13, and quarterback 14. The Bears have allowed the 6th most fantasy points to quarterbacks while also having the most takeaways in the entire NFL. So let's see what we get in Week 11. And Bo Nix, man, he destroyed a lot of us. I said I was a Bo Lever last week. Comes out against the Raiders. The process was good. That was a good matchup. Now he gets to play the Kansas City Chief. Now, I can't imagine he's going to have a worse game than what he did against the Raiders, but it's certainly not a great game here against the Chiefs. Geno Smith versus Dallas. Geno has not been good on the season. In 4-point passing touchdown leagues, he's had 2 games over 25 points, and he's had 6 games under 10 points. So either winning your week or losing your week, but losing your week more often than not. I can say that the Cowboys, it's great matchup. They allow the most fantasy points to quarterbacks. So there is that. And Tua versus the Commanders. Tua is kind of the same as Geno. He's had 2 performances over 20 points while he's had 4 games under 10 points, one of them being a negative game. And the matchup, it's the 3rd easiest matchup for quarterbacks. It's super hard to trust him even in super flex leagues. And Jacoby Brissett, again, I keep saying it, he should be higher. I really wish I could have him higher, but no Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to put him down in the rankings a little bit more. I originally had him a great deal higher, but nevertheless, he gets to play San Francisco 49ers. He's been the quarterback 12 or better in each of his 4 starts, thrown 2 touchdowns and 250 or more yards in each of them. And then, as always, we get to the deep tiers. I'm going E and F tier, combining them together. I can't recommend any of these guys with confidence. There's a lot of guys who have been just bad on the season, a lot of them who have really bad matchups as well. Now, let's go ahead and talk about some tight ends. And if you remember draft season, we had a big 3. Now, in week 11, we have the big 3 again. They're reunited. But in A tier, let's go ahead and talk about these guys. Sam Laporta versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, the Eagles are the 3rd hardest matchup for tight ends. However, Sam Laporta has had 5 receptions and 50 yards in 4 out of his last 5 games. Catching a touchdown in 3 of them. He's been rock solid here on the season. Arondé Gadsden versus the Jags. Now, I was surprised that he practiced in full on Wednesday. The Jags give up the 2nd most fantasy points to tight ends, and outside of last week where he left the game injured, he's been awesome. So if he's active, he should be started. I wouldn't worry about that too much. But B tier is where we start to worry about just a little bit. Jake Ferguson versus the Raiders. Now, the Raiders, they are the 5th hardest matchup for tight ends. In games without CeeDee Lamb, Ferguson was averaging 7 receptions and 51 yards, and he had 3 touchdowns during that 4-game span. In games with Lamb, Ferguson has been averaging 5 receptions for 36 yards, and he's had 2 touchdowns in a 5-game span. So he still should be started regularly, but maybe we look at him more of a matchup-dependent start going forward. And Travis Kelce versus the Denver Broncos. Now, unlike Ferguson, once Rashee Rice came back to the lineup, he's been arguably better with Patrick Mahomes. He's been perfectly fine on the season, and being attached to Patrick Mahomes means you are going to have some spike weeks. And Cade Otton versus the Buffalo Bills. The Bills have allowed the fewest fantasy points to tight ends on the season. Otton, however, has had 4 receptions and 40 yards in each of his previous 5 games. So the floor is certainly there. He's been allergic to the end zone, but hopefully he'll find that here soon. But here are some guys that are not allergic to the end zone. Talking about C tier. This right here could be the touchdown or bust tier. Goddard, Andrews, they've mainly been that on the season. Mainly low receiving volume from those guys, but a good bet for a touchdown on any given week. And Theo Johnson versus the Green Bay Packers. I mentioned Jameis Winston. He's averaged 45 pass attempts per game last season. I bumped him up with the other pass catchers, but Dart is really the one who elevated Theo Johnson. It's a gamble if Winston will as well. And then Dalton Schultz versus the Tennessee Titans. Now, Schultz doesn't belong in the touchdown or bust tier since he's had so much volume. He's had 5 or more receptions in 6 of his last 7 games. Found the end zone last week, finally, with Davis Mills, and we might get Davis Mills yet again in Week 11. And in D tier, you're kind of floating to a deeper category of streaming tight ends. Pitts, he's been an afterthought since Drake London has been getting hyper-targeted. Loveland played alongside Cole Kmet last week, and it lowered his ceiling. He's still a stash if you can hold him, but he's not a must-start at the moment. And Fannin, his ceiling, talking about that, it's nearly non-existent with Gabriel right now. Gabriel has failed to throw for over 200 yards in 4 out of his last 5 games, and he's got 6 passing touchdowns in 5 games so far this season. And Zach Ertz, he's one of the better options here this week. He does play the Dolphins, who have allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to tight ends. Now, E tier, yuck. It's players, if you're playing in a much deeper league, you can start them. Noah Fant, he gets to play the Steelers, who have allowed the 5th most fantasy points to tight ends, so you're really banking on a touchdown in that one. And then in F tier, it is the Steelers tight ends. Now, this is not for redraft leagues. This is more so for daily fantasy leagues or perhaps a parlay. But the Bengals, they've allowed 12 touchdowns this season to tight ends. The next highest has been 7. They've allowed the second most receiving yards to tight ends as well. Let's go ahead and talk about some defenses. We started off with 5 defenses. They are super great options this week. All these defenses are good or great defenses playing against teams that rank 24th or worse in points per game. I really bumped up the Packers defense this week because they are playing the Giants with Jameis Winston, and we know Jameis Winston loves to turn the ball over. Now in A tier, you've got a couple of defenses. It's strong defenses facing quarterbacks who have had their ups and downs when playing against tough defenses so far this season. And B tier, now the one you might have a question mark is going to be the Broncos. It's a weird situation. They are an elite defense, but they're playing against the Chiefs, and it's not an ideal matchup, certainly. I understand if you don't want to drop them because they do have great matchups after the bye. Now in C tier, I do know that these defenses are going to be ranked 12 through 16 for me, but I'd really prefer to have somebody in S, A, or B tier because all these matchups, except for the Patriots versus the Falcons, are expected to be shootouts. Now, in D tier, you do have the Cardinals, you have the Lions. I like the Cardinals and Lions defense this season, but not this week. The Cardinals versus Mac Jones, that could be pretty good. It does boost them up into C tier if he starts. And then in E tier, you will see one of the worst defenses in the entire NFL of the Cowboys. Now, we haven't got to see them with the recent trades that Jerry Jones made, but Geno Smith and the Raiders do not scare me. Geno Smith has 12 interceptions on the season, and it's the second most in the entire NFL. And then, as always, in F tier, I have all the rest of the defenses for you guys playing in much, much deeper leagues, so here you go. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the YouTube. I do go live each and every single day, so turn on notifications so you know when I go live. But I'm helping people out with trade advice, start sit, who has a good strength of schedule in the playoffs. All that stuff is great. You can find some extra stuff in the link in my bio if you want to check that out as well.